So much pranam again.
It's a pleasure to be here in this beautiful yoga studio this evening with all of you. And I think it'll be good if I can stand and speak. You know, I like looking at people when I speak to them.
Or do you want me to take away the chair?
No,
Or
let
is
it
it
be
okay?
there. If I feel very tired, sort of collapse. So let me start with a chant, as she said. Om asato ma sadgamaya tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityurma amritam gamaya. Om shanti shanti shanti. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. I hope all of you can hear me. Those at the back, can you hear me? Divya, can you hear me? Okay. We are here at this yoga studio, and it's very appropriate that we are here today. It all began here in America and in the West with this person, Swami Vivekananda. Some of you may have read in the Wall Street Journal a few years ago, there was an article, the man who brought yoga to the West, and that was Swami Vivekananda. From last year onwards, we have been celebrating the International Day of Yoga on the summer equinox, I think, on June 21st. And that's when this article was published, that where are the roots of yoga? In fact, if you read the book American Veda by Philip Goldberg, there he traces the entry and the spread and the influence of Indian philosophy, Indian thought in America and the West, and he traces it back. He begins the book with Swami Vivekananda. So he traces the influence of Indian thought in world thought, especially in America here and in American culture. He starts with Swami Vivekananda. And for those of you who are new to this picture is of Sri Ramakrishna, his spiritual master, who is regarded as, if not the greatest, certainly one of the greatest spiritual masters of the modern time in India. And then Ma Sharada Devi, whom we call the Holy Mother. She was Sri Ramakrishna's wife, but she's not up there because she was his wife. She is regarded as an equally great saint and spiritual teacher in her own light. I'm saying equally great, but actually if you go to the main monastery in near the river, on the river Ganges near Calcutta, where I've come from, there's a temple to her and there's a much bigger temple to him. And there are more people going all the time to her temple than to his temple. So that is Ma Sharada, Sri Ramakrishna, and his disciple Swami Vivekananda. That Vedanta is here today, that yoga is here today, that I am standing and we are talking about Upanishads here today is to a great extent due to his work. He came here in 1893, the World Parliament of Religions, to talk about Vedanta. Vedanta is the philosophy based on the Upanishads. Since we are standing in the yoga studio here, where you learn about asanas and pranayama, different kinds of yoga practices, which are mainly hatha yoga practices, but it's also an entry into the very profound philosophy of the Upanishads. Vedanta and Upanishads are synonymous. In fact, one of the definitions of Vedanta we gave when we teach the Vedanta is Vedanta Nama Upanishad Pramanam in Sanskrit. What does that mean? Vedanta is verily the spiritual knowledge found in the Upanishads. So the Upanishads and Vedanta are the same. What are the Upanishads? The Upanishads are the highest spiritual teachings found in the most ancient scriptures of the Hindus, the Vedas. The Vedas are the ancient scriptures of the Hindus, dated back at least to 6,000 years, and probably much more in oral transmission. And in them, a part of them, are the Upanishads, where you find the highest teachings, the highest spiritual teachings. And in fact, the Upanishads form the spiritual, the philosophical core of Hinduism. All of Hinduism can in some form or the other be traced back to the Upanishads. An incredible set of texts. There are several of them, we'll talk about that. What I'll do this evening is, I'm going to give some general introductory remarks about the Upanishads, and then we will take a look at the teaching itself, at the central teaching, and try to see what they are talking about. At least at the end of the talk, the takeaway from the talk will be a general idea about the Upanishads, but more importantly, a central teaching of the Upanishads. We should know what the central teaching is by the end of the talk. And if we follow very, very carefully, maybe even become enlightened. I'm not promising that. The second part of the talk will be an actual guided practice into the philosophy of the Upanishads, a philosophical inquiry to see who we really are. And I'd invite you to follow that very carefully. But first, a few words about the Upanishads. As I said, the Vedanta is based on the Upanishads, and there are many of these Upanishads at the end of the Vedas. I found it scattered throughout the Vedas, sometimes towards the end of the Vedas. And these Upanishads are, we talk about 10 principal Upanishads, major Upanishads, and a host of other Upanishads. There is a verse which you memorize when you study the Upanishads. There's a verse which you memorize to recite the names of the 10 principal Upanishads. And the verse goes something like this. Isha kena katha prashna mundamandukya titirihi aitareyam cha chandogyam brihad aranyakam tatha. These are, it may sound like, I won't say Greek and Latin, sound like Sanskrit, but because it is. But it's just a list of names of the 10 major Upanishads. What are those 10 Upanishads? The Isha Upanishad, Kena Upanishad, Katha Upanishad, Prashna Upanishad, Mundaka Upanishad, Mandukya Upanishad, Taittiriya Upanishad, Aitareya Upanishad, the Chandogya Upanishad, and the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So these are the 10 major Upanishads. Who decided which are the 10 major Upanishads? It's just because about 1400 years ago, this is India, so whenever you talk about old, you mean really, really old. You're talking thousands of years. I remember we as a group of young monks were taken on a tour of some old temples in Bengal. In Bengal, the temples are not particularly old. Somebody was showing us a particular temple and saying, this is the oldest temple we've got in Bengal, the particular province of India I come from. And it's about 600 years old. And I could see those monks who had come from other parts of India, especially the south of India. They were smiling. For them, 600 years is not old at all. For them, if you go back 1,000 years, that you're beginning to talk now. So there are temples in the south of India which are more than 1,000 years old. Now, about 14 or 1500 years ago, there was this great Indian philosopher, Shankaracharya, who selected 10 of the Upanishads to write elaborate commentaries. And we are grateful to him that he did that, because these Upanishads are so old, the language is sometimes so archaic, it's difficult in some cases to make out what they are saying. It's only because he has written those commentaries again in Sanskrit, but now we understand how profound these teachings are. And he selected these 10 Upanishads. So that's why they are called 10 major Upanishads, but there are many others. You come across a list of 108 Upanishads in one of the Upanishads themselves, in the Muktika Upanishad, a minor Upanishad. You come across a list of 108 Upanishads. There, I can't resist telling the story. And that's another thing you have to be ready with Indian philosophy. There are stories and stories within stories and stories within stories within stories. And somebody said, whenever you start the Puranas, a class of Indian scriptures, they start at the beginning. And by the beginning, they mean really the beginning. They start with the beginning of the universe. Every story starts with the creation of the universe. In the Muktika Upanishad, the story goes like this. The great incarnation of God, Rama, who is God himself, and his great devotee, Hanuman. Now, Hanuman asks Rama, how does one get enlightened? One gets moksha, enlightenment. And Rama says, you just read one Upanishad. What is that Upanishad? He says it's the Mandukya Upanishad. Mandukyam ekameva alam. The Mandukya alone is sufficient. Mumukshunam vimuktai. For the liberation, for the enlightenment of those who want enlightenment. Mandukya Upanishad is alone is sufficient. And the Mandukya is actually the smallest of the Upanishads. It's just a few mantras. Just a few mantras. Mandukya Upanishad itself, without the Karika. So that the smallest Upanishad is very small. You can just write it down in half a page, the Mandukya Upanishad. And the biggest of the Upanishad, the Brihadaranyaka, is a voluminous. It's really big. So the Upanishads in length, these texts are of all sizes. Now I was saying they're profound. Schopenhauer, the great German philosopher, he was one of the first Western philosophers to read the Upanishads. And that story in itself is fascinating. I won't go into that because then there's no end to it. You won't be going home before 11 o'clock in that case. But suffice it to say that a great Mughal prince, Dara Shikoh, he was interested in not only Islam but was interested in Hinduism, and he got the Upanishads translated from Sanskrit along with the commentaries into Persian. And this Persian version of the Upanishads was called Upanishad. And this was a young French Indologist, Anquetil Duperron, who was 21 years old when he came to India to search for ancient texts. And he got hold of this book, the Upanishad. And he brought it back to France, among other texts, and he translated them into Latin. And this original Sanskrit, translated into Persian, translated into Latin, came into the hands of, he published it, hands of this German philosopher, Schopenhauer. And he is on record as having said that I consider that there is no study in the world as edifying as the study of this Upanishad, this text, except perhaps the originals. They have been the solace of my life, and they shall be the solace of my death. And it seems, I was reading his life, he would never go to sleep after that without reading a few pages of the Upanishads. And he had this, his little dog, he named the little dog Atma, which in Upanishad means our real self. And so they are profound. They are, I have not come across any other body of literature quite like that. Incredible. Incredible. We shall see a little bit of that today. But first, in general, what do the Upanishads deal with? They deal with the most profound questions of life. Is there any ultimate reality in this universe? Call it God or whatever. Who am I? Who are we? What is the purpose of life? Is enlightenment, salvation, nirvana, moksha, whatever you call it, is it possible? What is it like? What is the purpose of this entire universe? What's the purpose of this game, which we are in the midst of? The greatest questions, the fundamental questions of life. And all of us, in every civilization, in every time, people have asked these questions. And all of us, we have asked these questions. Everybody, in fact, asks these questions, especially when we are teenagers. But then we sort of grow. The sadness is we grow out of these questions. The business of living catches up with us, and we grow out of these questions. I was joking, I was telling somebody that if you do not grow out of these questions, you just hold on to these questions, you either become a monk or you become a philosopher. And Schopenhauer had an interesting point about that. He used to say that there are two kinds of philosophers, a genuine philosopher and an academic philosopher. He says a genuine philosopher is a person who is puzzled by life, who looks at life and has these big questions. And an academic philosopher, according to him, is one who is puzzled by his books. But But to be fair, among the academic philosophers, many of them are genuine philosophers, and many of them came to academic philosophy because they had these questions. And when we are practicing yoga, we get another chance to ask these questions all over again. These Upanishads are about these profound questions. And in almost all of these Upanishads, you find a dialogue, which reminds you of the Socratic dialogues, you know. A person comes to a spiritual master and asks these questions. Let's look at some of these questions, and I will recite to you the original Sanskrit. It sounds beautiful. Imagine something that was composed, inspired, recited 60 centuries ago, 6,000 years ago, on the bank of the Ganges or the Saraswati River in India. This very language. In the Mundaka Upanishad, we find a student coming to the spiritual master and asking this question. It goes like this. The Sanskrit goes like this. Shaunako havai mahashalo angirasam vidivadupasannappapracha. Shaunaka, a well-to-do person, comes to the spiritual master Angiras and asks a question. It's mentioned that he comes to the master in the proper prescribed manner. The proper prescribed manner in India is you go down and bow down to the master and make an offering, and after the salutations you ask your question. What was the question? Kasmin no bhagavo vigyate sarvamidam vigyatam bhavati iti. Sir, O holy sir, what is that by knowing which I can know everything? What an interesting question to ask. Tell me that by knowing which I can know everything. In another Upanishad, we find a father asking his son, who's back from university. He finds the son has become arrogant. It seems he knows everything. And what does the old man know anyway? So he's maybe back from an Ivy League university at that time. And the father sees that this boy, his name is Shvetaketu. Shvetaketu has become proud and arrogant. So the father asks him, do you know that by which everything is known? Did your teachers teach you that? By knowing which everything is known? Same question. Same question. Eka vijnanena sarvam vijnatam. By one knowledge, everything is known. And Shankaracharya's humor is there. You know, the boy says, no, they didn't teach me. I don't even know that such knowledge is possible. They didn't teach me. Why don't you teach me? He tells his father. And the commentator, Shankaracharya, humorously adds there that he's scared of being sent back to college again. So he says, why don't you tell me? In other places, there's this beautiful story about a little boy who went to meet death. The boy's name is Nachiketa. It's a favorite story in India. So he goes to, little boy, he's maybe 9 or 10 years old. He goes to meet Yama, the Lord of Death. And he goes there, and Yama is pleased with him and grants him boons. You can ask me for 3 boons, any 3 things. And the final boon is the point. In the Katha Upanishad you find the third thing he asks this little boy, the final thing he asks is, okay, I should tell you the first and second, shouldn't leave you hanging. It's not a good way to tell a story. Basically, his dad was mad at him. The little boy's dad was annoyed with him and said something like, today here you would say, oh, go to hell, don't bother me. So, more or less he said that. Go to death. Oh, just go to death. And this being a story, he really goes to death, to the house of death. And he confronts death, and he asks these 3 boons. Death gives him 3 boons, the little boy. So the first thing he asked was, because he's a little boy, first thing he asked was like a very intelligent little boy, he asks, when I go back home, my dad shouldn't be mad at me anymore, he should love me. That's so cute, you know. You can see the psychology of the little boy. And it's so intelligent too. Nobody ever goes back from death. And this boy, he doesn't say, I should go back to life again. He assumes it. I'm going back. So when I go back, my dad should be happy with me. He should love me. So we can imagine death smiling, sort of touched, by the boy, and Says, okay, granted. And the second boon is, there was conventional religion in those days were fire sacrifices. So the little boy says, I see my dad doing these fire sacrifices, teach me the best fire sacrifice there is. And so the Lord of Death teaches him that. But the third question is the Upanishad. What is the secret of death? What lies beyond death? Is there something within us which does not die? Some people say there is, some people say there is not. Tell me the truth. And then the answer starts. So that's another question. In another Upanishad, Kena Upanishad, you find the same question in a very different way. Instead of saying, tell me one thing by which I know everything, the question is, how do I think? By what light within are my thoughts lit up? What inspires my words? How do I speak? How do I see? How do I hear? He's not asking for an explanation of physiology. How does the visual system work? How does an auditory system work? He's asking for one answer. What is that one thing which gives me the conscious first-person experience of seeing, of hearing? We are just now in this 21st century beginning to understand this question. In consciousness studies, if you have heard of the hard problem of consciousness, the problem of qualia, how do we get first-person experience? How do the brains work and what neurons fire and what activity is going on? That's supposed to be the so-called easy problem of consciousness. But the hard problem of consciousness is, how does all this physical activity, biochemical activity, neurological activity, translate into seeing the color red? Right? How do we taste, see, hear? How do we have the conscious experience which is our life? And thousands of years ago the question is being asked. The Upanishad starts with this question. Kene shitam padati preshitam mana kena prana prathama preti yukta kene shitam vacham imam vadanti chakshu shrotram kaudeva yunakti. What light shines in my thoughts? I'm aware of my thoughts. By what light are my words inspired? By what light am I able to see, hear, smell, touch? Our conscious life, our whole lives. He's basically asking about what? He's asking about consciousness. The question is about consciousness, the real nature of consciousness. He says, he calls it, what bright being within me shines through my senses and my mind? That's the question. I mean, one can only marvel at the depth and the sophistication of these questions. So, you have this range of questions. And what about the answer? Let me give you the answer in brief, and then we will go into the second part of the presentation where I'll guide you through this process. Come. Yeah. The answer goes like this. I'll quote from one of the Upanishads where the answer is found to be, let me quote from the Upanishad. It was a favorite with Swami Vivekananda when he came to this country. He would often chant the original Sanskrit, which I shall chant for you and then translate. What is the answer to these questions? By knowing what one thing, one knows everything. What is the light within me which shines through all my thoughts and feelings? The answer goes like this. Shrinvantu vishve amritasya putraha aye dhamani divyani tastu vedaham purusham mahantam aditya varnam tamasah parastat tameva viditva atimrityumeti nanyah pantha vidyate ayanaya. What does that mean? It's simple Sanskrit but very profound and poetic. It means, listen, ye children of immortal bliss. So the teacher is addressing all of us, all of humanity, as children of immortal bliss. Even those who dwell in higher spheres, the gods who dwell in heavens, you listen to, because what I'm going to say, you do not know. This highest teaching of the Upanishads. What is that? Vedaham Purusham Mahantam. I have realized that infinite being. Purusham Mahantam, infinite being. I have realized this infinite being. I have known that infinite being. What kind of infinite being? Aditya Varnam, blazing forth with a light like the sun. Not a material light like the sun, not a material light like this, the light of consciousness. Blazing forth. In the Bhagavad Gita, when Arjuna gets this experience in beautiful and awesome poetry, it's described as if 1,000 suns rise in the sky together. Not with the material light, would be burnt up. It's the light of consciousness. Tamasa Parastat, beyond all darkness, beyond the darkness of suffering and sorrow and death and limitation, there is some immortal reality which is beyond suffering and sorrow, our human limitations. Okay, suppose you have known such a thing, suppose such a thing exists. What good is it? What good does it do us? By knowing that alone, mortal man becomes immortal. One goes beyond death. One goes beyond suffering. Any other way? Any other way? We have other ways of overcoming suffering. You're sick, you go to the CVS, go to the doctor, assuming you have coverage. If you don't have coverage, there is a job, you can go and earn money. If you're bored, there's a television for you. Somebody said it's the golden age of television. You don't know, Swami, what you are missing. There's so many TV serials for you to see. So, if you're bored, you go to the television or play video games. But none of them are permanent solutions for the human condition. Every one of them has a limitation. They either come to an end and after that you are still dissatisfied, you still want more. Or they do not give you that satisfaction which you wanted from them. When you get it, you finally see this was not worth it. Everything in human life is infected with this problem, except spiritual enlightenment. That's the promise that there is something, an infinite existence. If you realize that, you go beyond the limitations, the human limitations of death, sorrow and suffering. So that's the answer. And all the Upanishads give it in different language. That's one point. But that's just the grand beginning theme. They go to something even greater. Where is this infinite reality? You're talking about an infinite consciousness, an immortal consciousness. Where is it? Where do I find it and how do I find it? And here comes the highest teaching of the Upanishads. If there's nothing you go away from this talk with, just go away with this. The Upanishads say with one voice, that thou art. Where is that infinite reality? Brahman, pure consciousness, whatever. You are that. You just don't know it. You are that. In the Upanishads we find what are called Mahavakyas, the great statements. The great, not in, you get pretty long sentences in Sanskrit. I've seen sentences, one sentence covering a whole page. But these sentences are short sentences, but they are great because they are profound. And each of these great sentences, we take 4 in the Upanishads, from different Upanishads. They all mean the same thing. They all mean the same thing. You are that infinite reality. You are that. In the Chandogya Upanishad you find Tat Tvam Asi. That boy who was arrogant and his father began to teach him that infinite reality. And after teaching him that, he says that there is some infinite reality from which this universe has come, in which the universe exists, into which it disappears finally. We can imagine the boy going, so? Okay, that's great, but so, what does it have to do with me? And the father tells him, Tat Tvamasi Shvetaketu, oh my boy Shvetaketu, you are that infinite reality. Now he can't go so, because we are now talking about him. What's the most interesting subject for each of us? I myself, the vertical I. Whether we admit it or not, we are infinitely interested in ourselves. And it's bad when it's the small self we are interested in. We see that it's bad. But it points to something interesting. There is something within us which deserves that attention. That thou art Shvetaketu. You are that infinite self which we are talking about. In the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, we find even more directly, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. Brahman, the infinite reality. I am Brahman. People sometimes get shocked. Are you claiming I am God? Brahman is the word for God in Hinduism. Are you seriously saying that you are God? Yes, but not just me. You too, and everybody and everything is. Whatever we see in this life, whatever we experience, is an appearance of that reality. There's a famous Hindu monk who came to USA also. Now he had a brother who had some mental problems, and he was in an asylum in those days. So this monk, he went back to visit his brother, and his brother said, you say that I am God. I also say that I am God. And people revere you and fall at your feet, and they lock me up. It's so unfair. It's so unfair. Then his brother, the monk, explained to him, yeah, when I say I am God, I mean all of us are one with God. Everybody, irrespective of gender or caste or color, not even just human beings. All beings are one with God. We share the same divine essence. We are that. But the mistake you make is you say, I am God, worship me. And they lock you up, of course. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. In the Mandukya Upanishad, the little Upanishad I mentioned, which is the most powerful of the Upanishads, there you find, I am Atma Brahma. This very self is Brahman. Same meaning, that thou art, I am Brahman, this very self is Brahman. They all mean the same thing. And in the Aitareya Upanishad you find Prajnanam Brahma. Consciousness, this consciousness within, right now, this awareness, this sentience which we all experience, if you properly understand this, that is the infinite divine reality, Brahman. So these 4 sentences are called Mahavakyas. All of them mean the same thing, and all of them are the core teaching of the Upanishads. Okay, I think that's good as an advertisement, like an introduction. But shall we look deeper? Let's look deeper. What is this infinite reality, and how am I this infinite reality, and how can I know it, and how can I realize it? If that is the question, and that should be our question, can you show us a little more? Let's see a little more. The Upanishads say that to realize this reality is the purpose of life. Swami Vivekananda, he put it more directly. Each soul is potentially divine. To manifest this reality, to manifest this divinity is the goal of religion. And all religious practices, whether you are meditating, whether you are doing devotional practices, worshipping God, whether you are serving, doing